Hello guys, welcome to the video. My name's Ali, and today I'll be discussing gear progression in Final Fantasy XIV, as well as continuing the discussion on how gear and dungeons affect one another and how they affect the way we interact with them. So without any further ado, let's begin. Now, as you see throughout the video, I'm going to be doing some pretty ridiculously sized pulls. And of course, these big pulls, as we call them, wall-to-wall pulls, are the standard meta for dungeon gameplay. But what is it that allows me to do such things, you know? And in my opinion, it is the fact that my gear is so high leveled compared to the minimum item level of the dungeon. Now, if you were to examine my character, you would see that I am wearing the item level 480 Edenverse gear, and that gear allows me to pull off some pretty crazy stunts in this dungeon. It essentially buffs my stats high enough that I'm able to take on these huge packs of enemies while defending myself, and of course my healer does a pretty good job of keeping me alive. Now, in this game, gear follows what we call vertical progression. And most games, vertical progression is when your gear, you farm gear that becomes stronger over time, and then you become stronger over time as a result. But what this game really lacks is horizontal gear progression, which is when your gear, say you have two characters with the same gear sets, but they specialize in different things. And that's not really existent in FF14 anymore. And I think that's quite a crime because a lot of the dungeon design in this game sort of lends itself to becoming easier the stronger our gear gets, but without any specialization or without any sort of way to differentiate between gear, between tanks, it all just kind of becomes the same thing where every tank gets geared up in the best gear they can get and they do giant pulls. Now, that's not so bad were it not for the way gear is obtained in this game. Now, back in the previous expansions, the way gear progression worked was that you would start off with your artifact gear after hitting the level cap, and then you could buy sort of the crafted gear. If you didn't have the artifact gear, you could buy the crafted gear, which was about the same level as the artifact gear. And then what you would do after getting that gear is you would do your dailies, collect your tombstones, and you would get better gear from that, which you could then use to take on the normal or savage raids to get even better gear. But as of Shadowbringers, what they've done is that crafted gear is so strong that it actually equals the normal gear that I'm wearing from the Eden 2nd series. What does that mean? That's pretty bad because that means that new players nowadays can simply walk into the market board after hitting level 80, buy the level 480 Neo-ish Guardian gear, and then they can go take on all of the new challenges. Now, I know a lot of players that are coming back would say, hey, that's not that bad because that allows me to jump right into the action. But I believe that that sort of level progression, that progression of the gear is really bad for new players. They don't get the experience of working on their rotation and working on their game sense every day through doing dailies because there's no point in doing dailies. Why would you run your roulettes for tombstones when you can just buy the gear off the market board? There's absolutely no point. The gear from the market board is just straight up better than the deep shadow gear. So why would you even do that, right? Why not just buy gear for your jobs? Now, the other thing that it does is that every patch cycle that comes out and every raid tier that comes out, there's new crafted gear that completely invalidates the last set of gear. So in 5.4, we'll probably see gear that comes out that's even stronger than not only the Eden normal gear, but it might be even stronger than the Eden Savage gear. And that completely invalidates the work of the people that worked to farm their gear, gear up their jobs, all the work they did last patch for nothing. And I don't think that's really cool. I think it's really unfortunate not only for them, but as I said, for the new players who don't get that sort of daily training from doing the dungeons every day. Now, as for the way gear affects dungeons, I'm sure most of you have noticed that if you walk into a level 50 or 60 dungeon, you can kind of just waltz in without a care in the world, slap everything in the dungeon, and leave. And that's because our gear is so much higher in terms of stats compared to the minimum item level of the dungeon. Take, for example, level 50 and 60 dungeons, right? Let's say you get Wanderer's Palace. If you've ever noticed, Wanderer's Palace drops gear of like item level 55 or 60, I want to say. But if you walk in with item gear that's been synced to level 120, of course you're going to completely decimate everything that exists in that dungeon because your stats are just so inflated compared to what the dungeon was balanced for. And now, of course, people will say, but hey, man, if I worked for this gear, I should be overpowered in these older dungeons, right? That is true. But I think that the sort of like the scale of overpoweredness is a little too strong, in my opinion. Our gear is just too strong for a lot of this older content, and it completely invalidates a lot of the mechanics. And that's why you end up in situations where in the newest dungeon that came out as a 5.3, a lot of players don't know what they're doing in there because there's a lot of mechanics that they've never seen before. And why is that? Because their gear is so strong that they just powered through the mechanics and were able to bypass them. I mean, just take a look at Circus Tower from the Alliance raids. That place is so incredibly. Our gear is just so much stronger than what that dungeon was made to do that even if we're item synced along with our abilities, it would just completely bypass mechanics in that tower to the point where it's been called no mechanics tower. And that's really unfortunate because a lot of the older dungeon design, as I said in the last video, was a lot better than the current dungeon design. It was a lot more thought provoking and made you really think. Now, one thing I will say about Holminster Switch that I do think would be sort of a remedy to this gear problem is that the enemies in Holminster Switch, those little gremlins, they actually leave a slow debuff on the tank that's incredibly detrimental, and that the healers should remove ASAP. And I think that if the dungeons were to incorporate more mechanics like that, more detrimental abilities, and sort of like secondary objectives that the players would have to fulfill in order to continue fighting, that may alleviate some of the pressure of gear because, as we all know, it's not as if you can outgear a slow debuff or it's not as if you could outgear a doom debuff. And so adding things like that may alleviate the problem that gear is causing with a lot of the older dungeons. But as of this moment, a lot of the dungeons, as I said, you can stroll through them because our gear is so powerful. Now, another thing I think that devs could implement possibly is to sort of low close the distance between the minimum item level and the synced level of the dungeon, sort of like the way that leveling dungeons have a minimum item level for entry, but the distance between minimum item level to maximum item level is not that high, which is why leveling dungeons tend to be a little more difficult than the capstone dungeons, which is where a lot of the dungeons, a lot of the disparity between the levels of dungeons exists and the levels of gear. Now, of course, these are just my opinions, but this is one of the major things I've realized that this game has, and it's that every time there's a new expansion, the content from the older expansions becomes almost trivial, and it's a little unfortunate to see. But I believe that with the right changes, the game devs could definitely change that. Now, that's all I've got for today's video, guys. Take care as always. Peace.